Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. This is the first full episode in our mini-series on Exvangelicalism, and we're starting by taking a closer look at the thing Exvangelicalism is leaving. We've invited Professor Mark Noll, one of the world's leading experts in the history of the evangelical movement. Mark Noll helps us to map the complex and ever-changing definition of evangelical through its different phases in history as well as in different parts of the world. This sets us up nicely to examine the Exvangelical movement in the next few episodes. I hope you enjoy listening.
Thanks so much for being with us today, Mark. It's really a pleasure to have you on the podcast. We were just talking about how Barney and I both attended Regent College, and Mark has taught there quite a lot over the years. And Regent itself is maybe an interesting and important part of the kind of history of evangelicalism in North America.
Right. Certainly over the years, I've really enjoyed being there almost always for summertime for a week, and in the early days, a 2-week class, I think once even a 3-week class. Clearly
wow, I didn't know they did 3-week classes.
Well, quite a while. That would maybe in the 1990s. Regent, like almost every place that calls itself evangelical, shares a lot with other places that also call themselves evangelical, but coming out of the United States into Canada, and usually having a class that was made up roughly a third or more Canadians, maybe a fourth Americans, a third to a half people from other parts of the world, meant that the evangelical emphases tended to be generic rather than place specific. And particularly over the last maybe 15 or so years, Regent has done a really good job of remaining, what should we say, not exactly nonpartisan, but apartisan, or not really invested in some of the important cultural matters and intense partisanship of the United States. And
has refused to become polarized, is perhaps.
Well, I think so, certainly in many ways. And then, not insignificantly, Regent has a great bookstore, and the number of religious institutions of all kinds in the United States that maintain a good bookstore is shrinking, and the number of evangelically related institutions that have bookstores has also been shrinking. So quite apart from Vancouver as a pleasant place to visit in the summertime, and quite apart from the really engaging student body, it's always been a treat to have the kind of evangelical emphases at Regent that I was privileged to experience.
Yeah, I spent every last dime that I had at that bookstore during my time in Vancouver.
Me too.
That was great. And I really enjoyed it. Like you said, I remember the first kind of group that I had, CTC was a class we had to take, and then we'd be broken up into discussion groups. And there was about 12 of us from 12 different countries in that group. And I was like, wow, this is a whole different world. It's really, really valuable.
Well, it was a privilege to teach 2 or 3 different times courses on the recent world history of Christianity. And then I remember I was called upon to talk briefly about the history of Christianity in Brazil, and that if somebody from Brazil there, and actually to correct what I said, but what I had to say, same thing happened. I needed to say something about Ethiopian Christianity. There was someone in the class who did that. And then given Regent's location and it's really strong outreach over the years for those classes, whenever I talked about anything in China or the Chinese diaspora, there were always multiple people, native-born Chinese people, Canadian Chinese, Americans and Canadians who visited China. So it was a terrific opportunity for a historian to be talking about something that I just read about, but then to have people right there who were experiencing what I was trying to explain to the class.
And I was a student in one of those classes. That was the 20th century Christianity, and I remember, especially the students then sometimes disagreeing, but often just the thing you explained, they then had stories to sort of unpack, and it was really, really cool. So that's as an intro, we've invited you to talk with us because we're doing a series on Exvangelicalism. Barney and I both recently moved back to the States, and seeing this as a kind of significant conversation happening. But before we get into exvangelicalism, we thought it'd be helpful to understand what is evangelicalism, what is sort of being reacted against, and sort of what's going on there. So,
what is it that people are leaving?
Yeah, what are people leaving? And maybe getting a deeper sense than just sort of what is it today, but what has it been, and some of that kind of continuity, discontinuity. So maybe to just kick things off, can you tell us what is evangelicalism? Where did it come from? For some of the kind of big developments over time?
Just small questions.
Yes.
You know.
A historian who's been thinking about these things for probably more than 50 years. So just relax, and 3 hours later we'll come to my...
Perfect.
Let me try to simplify. Historically considered, the word evangelical actually comes out of the Middle Ages. So the Franciscans, who were willing to give up ordinary life to be servants of other people and remarkable, were actually called evangelical examples. But the modern usage of the term begins with the Reformation. So the Lutherans and the Calvinists, eventually the Anabaptists, were people who stressed the gospel, the Evangelion, and Protestantism roughly was known as evangelical. And then in the late 17th century and the 18th century in Europe and the American colonies, there were revival movements, the awakenings in Britain and the colonies, pietism on the continent, that stressed out of the Protestant heritage the need for an active faith by individuals appropriated. The language is used today sometimes of a personal relationship with Christ. I don't think that language was used much then or even in the 19th century, but it was a expansion and deepening of the Protestant heritage by people appropriating things for themselves. The Protestant heritage was belief in the Bible, the Trinity, Christ's saving work. And then on into the 19th century, and particularly the United States and Canada, and to a lesser extent in Britain, evangelicals were those groups that tended to stress those matters, not to the exclusion of denominational loyalties, but as the most. 20th century gets really complicated because into the 20th century in the United States, almost all Protestants, even sometimes Unitarians, if you can think of that, looked upon themselves as evangelicals. Complication.
Oh, really? Okay.
It is interesting, and actually some of the interrogation of loose and casual reference to evangelicals in the last 10 or so years has led people to dig more deeply into who exactly is calling themselves an evangelical. The fundamentalist modernist controversy that was a major well-publicized series of debates in the United States tended to move away from that sense that, well, all Protestants are in some sense evangelical, toward a division in Protestantism that I think was overstressed because it was always a middle group of people who were nervous about innovations, biblical higher criticism, but still wanted to maintain the traditions. And there was always people nervous about those things who wanted to emphasize them but stay toward the Protestant people. Coming out of the fundamentalist reaction against modernist Protestantism, we're a group of young men, mostly in the late 1930s and 1940s, who founded institutions like the National Association of Evangelicals, using that once generic word for people who wanted to maintain the fundamentals of the faith, Trinity, cross of Christ, authority of Scripture, but did not want to have the fundamentalist flight from engagement with the world. That's a narrower definition of evangelical. It worked in many ways quite well. It led eventually to activities by people like Billy Graham, who was for decades kind of the face of American evangelicalism. And again, the emphasis was on the authority of the Bible, the need for an active, personally engaged faith, an emphasis upon Jesus as the Son of God, the Trinity, and salvation through Christ. More recently, as almost everybody who knows about the United States knows, the word evangelical has been associated in political terms with white traditionalists who supported the Republican Party. I think much of the confusion and much of the entanglement over what evangelical means comes out of the United States, where what had been mostly, not exclusively, but mostly a designation for a kind of Christianity has been broadened in the U.S. to talk about a kind of approach to public life, political life, and social life. And that has led to a great deal of confusion. I think
I think that is confusing, because I also, am I right in thinking that remains largely an American feature? This association of evangelicalism with a particular political leaning.
Yes, and when you said a kind of prompts of things you might want to talk about today, I underscored that matter in what you sent, because what I've been talking about in the confusion or the intermingling or something of a word with a particular religious heritage and a way of religious defining with the social and political is almost exclusively American. It's not entirely American, but it's almost exclusively. Earlier this morning, in preparation for our conversation, I was looking at the website of the World Evangelical Alliance, which is a worldwide organization that pulls together evangelical associations in different parts of the world. So I was clicking on a few of these. The Trinity and Tobago Council of Evangelical Churches, 41 organizations, some of them with names I'd never heard of, some of them related, Methodist, Baptist, African Methodist, Episcopal. One of the 41 had the word evangelical in its name, but all of them signed on to the World Evangelical Association basic doctrinal statement. Again, Bible, Trinity, Christ is the Son of God, salvation through Christ, real work of the Holy Spirit, the resurrection at the end of time. Nothing about who you're going to vote for. Nothing about your stand on what? Gun control laws. But a definition keyed to what had been a religious. So, yes, the confusion that exists is, I think, an American situation, but because the United States is so important, people know about the United States and so much communication comes from the United States, that confusion sometimes spills over to the rest of the world.
And especially, I mean, America is particularly important in evangelicalism because it's one of the only Western countries that has a significant proportion of evangelicals in the population. I know there's a lot of countries in the global south which have a lot of evangelicals, but in like Europe, there's a very small number of evangelicals, not politically significant anyway.
No, I think that's exactly right. There are strong evangelical traditions in the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, in the German, and here's confusion, the German Evangelische Kirche, which is the Lutheran Church of Germany. And the Germans have, of course, they divide everything up very carefully. They talk about Evangelikale Christen in der Evangelischen Kirche. So
they actually have two words, which actually makes it less confusing, right?
Right. Yes.
Evangelisch just means Protestant, right?
Yes. And exactly. I mean, there are certain places in the world, Nigeria, for example, which has maybe 100 million affiliated Christians. A very strong proportion of them would be evangelical in some meaningful sense of the word. Chinese diaspora Christian faith today is maybe a fourth Catholic and 3/4 Protestant, and of those 3/4 Protestants, there'd be a lot of people evangelical by religious definition. And to make matters hyper confusing in the modern day, around the world and in the United States and Canada as well, there would be Roman Catholics who look an awful lot like evangelicals, even though historically Protestantism, evangelical movements coming out of Europe defined themselves as over against Roman Catholics. But it was a treat working at the University of Notre Dame and encountering undergraduates and a few graduate students to say, we're very Catholic, but yeah, we look to the Holy Spirit to guide us in reading the scriptures. We trust Christ alone for salvation. Of course, we listen to the Pope and to the bishops, but our confidence is in the Word made flesh within us. Well, not quite traditional evangelical language, but very, very close. So, a complicating situation, and as you've suggested, the terms at least are very different in world usage and in the United States.
Yeah, I think it's so helpful. And I mean, it was something, again, going back to Regent, that was immediately evident to me coming from an American context and studying there and being like, well, these people are evangelicals, but they're not talking about any of the stuff that we were always talking about. Yeah.
Yes.
What kind of things? What kind of things did you mean, Austin? Like abortion, or?
Well, I think, I just realized that because I went to Colorado Christian University, and at that university, the kinds of debates that we were having, we were always this close together, and we were debating, the fine points of, just we all assumed the same kind of basic philosophical worldview. Right? No, I mean, not only was like no one a Democrat, but even within, we had the same politics, we had the same social views, and we kind of debate these little tiny things. And then suddenly, people from around the world who couldn't even make sense of the frameworks I would use to talk about being evangelical and the things. And I realized that a lot of at the time, my identity as an evangelical was wrapped up with mostly American things that people were just like, what are you talking about? And then I was like, I don't know. I just thought this was something we all thought. It's hard to remember exactly the details, but it was my first sense that like, oh, most of this is my culture, not really my faith.
Well, it's a good illustration in the United States of that kind of complexity with the history of African American Christianity.
Mm.
An awful lot of Black church adherents, historically in the present, would be, by all religious definitions, clearly evangelical. So a famous characterization of evangelicalism coming from Britain is from the historian David Bebbington, who in a very important book called Evangelicalism in Modern Britain, identified 4 things as characteristic of evangelical. So authority of the Bible, usually an experience of conversion, or at least a personal connection to the faith, then a belief that salvation comes through the cross of Christ, and then activity in living out the faith. And those characteristics have marked a huge proportion of the Black Christian denomination of the United States. But because of the way in which U.S. history worked, and especially in the last 15 years or so of political religious intermingling, you have to ask the question, well, are these kind of African-American Christians, are they evangelicals? Well, historically, most of them voted for the Democratic Party. Historically, they have not divided personal faith in Christ and then the need for some kind of liberation in the public sphere. So they've been, in American terms, they've been both evangelistic and even fundamentalistic on doctrine, but committed to the social gospel also. That's not a mixture.
What do you mean by the social gospel for our audience who may not be familiar with the term?
So I've been privileged over the recent years to study a really significant Black Presbyterian pastor in Washington, D.C., by the name of Francis Grimke. He was active from the 1880s into the early 1930s as a pastor of the major Black Presbyterian church in D.C. He was, in his commitment to the Christian basics, evangelical, and almost you would say fundamentalist. He has a very famous series of sermons in which he urged his people to avoid alcohol. So in a way that was characteristic more of fundamentalist Baptists than of white Presbyterians. He was disturbed when he went to hear W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a very important Black intellectual, when Du Bois talked about the Christian faith as negotiable, as something you could get rid of. So he's very gospel-oriented. But he's also a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He's also a critic of President Woodrow Wilson for resegregating the American civil service. And he also urges his congregation in their personal and corporate lives to do what they can against the structures of American systematic racism. Now, there were a few white evangelicals of the era who combined those things, but not very many. Those things tended to be moving apart, maybe not as much as historians think, but they were tending to be moving apart. In today's political rhetoric, however, you hear, well, evangelicals voted 80% for Donald Trump. Well, white evangelicals defined a certain way maybe did, but Black evangelicals defined religiously didn't. So that kind of complexity which takes a paragraph to talk about instead of a phrase, is lost in an awful lot
That's
of.
right. People often drop the word white when they
do.
talk about evangelical support for the Republican Party, whereas actually it's just white evangelical support.
Yeah.
And another complexity, when we're talking about complexity, recently read survey of that white evangelical bloc, done almost always, sometimes respecting the religion, but done to see the political payoff.
Mhm.
What survey researchers show is that maybe 20%, maybe a fourth of white evangelical Christians who identify that way in the United States don't ever go to church.
Hmm.
Well, historically considered, evangelical is a word designating a part of it, the church-going Christian population.
Yeah.
So the politics introduce a lot of complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. This maybe you've mentioned this another episode we did, but I vividly remember during Trump's last term having people come out of the woodworks telling me that I wasn't a Christian for not supporting Trump, and these were people who had never been to church, had never called themselves Christians, and suddenly were very much about we're the Christians, but they still weren't going to they didn't go to church, they didn't never read the Bible, but the and I was like, I don't know what this conversation is, I don't know what's happening right now. But yeah.
It feels like a sort of like one of those adventure stories, trying to trace the word evangelical now, trying to track it down, like hunt it down into all these different pockets of meaning that it seems to be getting. But I mean, I mean, we asked you to talk about evangelicalism, even though this is a series about exvangelicalism, and I don't know if you've done any study of exvangelicalism, but on the basis of what you do know, what is it that is prompting people to want to leave evangelicalism while still retaining some aspect of faith?
I haven't studied the ex-evangelical phenomenon as such. I've read some of the books and seen some of the articles, and then over time read a fair bit in studies of people who have left evangelical expressions of Christianity. Very, very famously in the 19th century, John Henry Newman in Britain, raised certainly in the evangelical strand of the Church of England, eventually became disillusioned with what he saw as a kind of thin historical and thin devotional and doctrinal characters of evangelical, and became a Roman Catholic. That's a very different thing, I believe, than what we have experienced or experiencing now. Also, a very fine book by David Hempton, Irish-born historian of Christianity, who was recently retired as the dean of the Harvard Divinity School, on evangelicals in the 19th century, who for one reason or another left the evangelical rooted. And in those cases, there were almost always a sense that something intellectual or something devotional or something ethical was lacking in the evangelical tradition, and as in response, then the people would leave, like Angelina Grimke, an early Bible believing but anti-slavery, and we would say in today's terms, feminist activist in America. Okay, in the present, at least what I'm aware of, I think most of those people who are talking about leaving the evangelical world see it as a liberation from a kind of narrow social and cultural straitjacket that may have been all right when they didn't know about the rest of the world, but in finding out about how things work in the broader world becomes too onerous. The ones that I've remember anyways are mostly from women who are reacting particularly against what have been I would say not new, but emphasized strictures on how men and women are to relate in family life, men and women to relate in church life, even men and women to relate in society. It's too simple to say that such ones read a little bit of modern feminism and then recognize that their church backgrounds are either anti-feminist or not fully feminist, and then react. But that I think is one of the strands. it's also, I think, alongside this, some of the 19th century characteristics, some of the 19th century stories are replicated in our day. I was privileged for 10 years to teach at the University of Notre Dame, which was a wonderful institution for all kinds of Christian belief, and obviously especially for those who were Catholic. And I didn't know that when I signed my contract that one of my jobs would be to talk to evangelical students who were attracted to Catholicism. And sometimes, maybe 6 or 7 times over that 10-year period, I talked to people who, for more 19th century reasons having to do with what they saw as the intellectual or theological or ethical weakness of evangelical, actually looking kindly on Roman Catholicism, or in 1 or 2 cases, Eastern Orthodoxy. So I think the phenomenon you're working on is probably more related to the former rather than the later. That is, it's been reaction to the social, political, cultural stance of some evangelical churches than to these historical Catholic Protestant decision. But clearly an important phenomenon of our day.
Yeah, and it's something, it's more about this shift in the meaning of the word evangelical and its political narrowing that I think more people are leaving, not to become Catholic or Orthodox, but not to. Some of them leave behind Christianity altogether, don't they? But many of them want to sort of retain some kind of faith, and so they don't know how to define it, which is why the term exvangelical started to appear, because they're like, well, I'm not an evangelical, I am a Christian, I'm not any other denomination, so what am I?
Yeah, it's really illuminating, I think, to compare this with, because obviously people have left evangelicalism or any tradition throughout the history, and seeing sort of what drove those kinds of things and what they were moving to, right? Often, especially earlier in evangelicalism. I mean, obviously some people, we have early forms of atheism or something in the kind of modern period, but often moving to more kind of historic, ancient traditions. And partly, my sense is that it's because evangelicalism in America committed itself so strongly to a very particular social and political view that then, right, historically that wouldn't have been the case for, say, evangelicals in the 19th century. My right to think that there's a bit more diversity in terms of you could call yourself an evangelical but have some differing political views, whereas really in the late 20th century you can't. You have to either toe that line or people feel like they have to leave.
Yes, and although, again, I'm just wondering what the effect of massive public and not very sophisticated attention to these matters means, because at least the memoirs that I've read and seen are obviously people very seriously troubled by the constrictions, the constrictive character of the faith in which they were raised. But then as a Protestant and evangelical myself, I kind of wanted to shout, well, there are other varieties of evangelical Christianity that you might have found more less restrictive, less constrictive, and the one in which you were raised, so that there are evangelical churches, and again, to bring up the black churches, there are evangelical churches that have always been looking out for the poor, always been looking out for those who are most disadvantaged. I think issues of gender and sexuality are maybe more difficult, but there's certainly been Christian groups for whom the integrity of the family has not led to looking upon homosexual instincts as the one great sin. Evangelical churches, Orthodox churches, Catholic churches, traditional churches don't sign on to the appropriateness of homosexual behavior, but there's many varieties in those more traditional churches of compassion and effort to understand instead of just simple denunciation and simple exclusion. And at least my wish for at least some of the people that I've read about or read is that they might have experienced some of these other groups, maybe still left, but maybe have found something more deeply rooted in Christian compassion as well as Christian truth than what they found in their own circumstances.
So are you arguing there that people who abandon evangelicalism because of a perceived sort of hostility towards the LGBTQ community, for example, are sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, their experience has been not of evangelicalism as such, but of a bad variety of it?
Well, that one matter is a particularly delicate one because there, with maybe just very few exceptions, there are no evangelical traditions, as there are no classically traditional Christian positions of any kind that are welcoming and affirming without qualification of, say, homosexual practice. There are, however, pretty wide evangelical, as there are pretty wide traditional Christian variety on how to approach these matters, and sometimes with compassion, sometimes with the obvious need to repent for overreacting against instances of same-sex attraction, as well as many communities where the opposition is strident and so unnuanced and panicky. So that one issue is actually maybe the most difficult one to.
Well, we can pick another issue then.
Racial accommodation. There are certainly strongly evangelical churches where there's just been an inability to recognize that the racist discrimination is really baked into some aspects of American public life. And there are evangelical groups that realize that that's a part of the American Christian past that needs to be repented of and worked against. And that's theoretically, not necessarily in practice, but theoretically, that issue is a lot simpler than the one of gender and sexual attraction.
I want to talk a bit about some of the interpretive divides in the historical study of evangelicalism. I know this has long been a conversation, but maybe again a kind of conversation because of the significance of evangelicalism in politics and society. I just wanted if you could speak to, all the debates about what is and isn't evangelicalism, and what are people after in those kinds of conversations.
Yes, I think until we come to the modern period, and I guess I mean by modern World War II and after, differences between Christian groups, I think, meant more to those Christian groups because the society as a whole was more or less friendly to Christian faith. So I'm thinking, for example, of the difference between Baptists and Presbyterians, or, baptize children and don't. I mean, this was taken to be a really serious matter and a reason for dividing churches, and sometimes inflaming pretty intense controversies. It's the same with when Pentecostalism arose as a widespread movement in the early 20th century. There were Wesleyan and holiness denominations that historically you see they really are the ground out of which Pentecostalism came, responded to Pentecostal movement as something almost demonic. And then there were more traditional, Reformed and Episcopal congregational movements who just thought Pentecostalism was so strange. It just whatever it was couldn't really be important as a Christian faith. Fast forward to the 1950s, and one of the first groups to join the National Association of Evangelicals is the Assemblies of God. Well,
okay, one of the biggest Pentecostal denominations.
Exactly, right. And over the course of time, other Pentecostal groups have joined the National Association of Evangelicals and been well accepted. It doesn't mean that then the Baptists or the Presbyterians or the Free Church people or the Independent Bible Church people that are also in the NEA, the NAE, it doesn't mean that they accept Pentecostalism as the best way of expressing Christian faith, but the kind of disagreements that used to break fellowship and prevent cooperation, in many cases, no longer do.
Well, that's a good story. That's a good ending to the story. You often hear about more and more conflict, not about resolution.
Right.
But I'm thinking about one of the books that I first read of yours many years ago, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. I remember when I read it, it really animated me in a good way. I was like, gosh, it is a scandal that there's evangelicalism is lacking in this intellectual depth and rigor, and we need to do something about it. I wonder if do you still agree with what you wrote in that book, because I think you published it in like 1994 or something, and B, do you think if there's any truth to it still, that is something of a reason for people leaving evangelicalism as well, that they just feel that it's intellectually shallow or incoherent?
Yes, I was asked by the publisher, the friends at William B. Erdman's, to write a new introduction and afterward to the reissue of the book just a year or two ago, and it was a good experience because I did come to strongly feel that the basic message of the book was correct, that there is in evangelical traditions a deficit in serious intellectual life. There are too few Jonathan Edwards, too many people who just practice the ready, fire, aim approach to Christian life. Too many people that admirably want quick and popular results, but not admirably lack serious attention to important things. So that part, I think I still agree with. What changed and what I did not, I think, emphasize strongly enough or see clearly enough when the research was done in the book is the challenge for the church as a whole to use the intellectual gifts and achievements properly. Certainly over the last 30, 40 years, and probably even longer than that, there's been a really remarkable surge of serious scholars willing to identify themselves as Christians, sometimes evangelical, sometimes evangelical friendly, sometimes other kinds of traditional Christians, who are really active and at the forefront of their intellectual life. The Christian Philosopher Association has over 1,000 members, and some of them are the most well-respected people in the philosophical profession, and it'd be sort of the same in some other field. Yet, what I did not see clearly enough when the book was being written is how important it is for such scholars to be actively involved in the churches, and how important it is for the churches to look upon the scholars as a gift and not a problem. So what the situation I see now is that there is a lot of really good Christian scholarship, more than I think any time in American history, but that scholarship really doesn't filter too far down into the popular level of the churches.
Oh, I see. So there's a bit of a gap between the academia, the academics, and the non-academics in the church.
I think it's the fault lies on both sides. And the second part of the question, yes, I do think there are still people who are leaving evangelical traditions because they think they're intellectually shallow. And again, the same kind of plea. Well, if you feel that way, think about looking in other directions for other serious Christian voices. And you could say the same for climate studies, historical studies, legal studies, history of science. There are just sterling examples of people who are standing firmly in the reputation of their disciplines and standing firmly on the Christian faith. Yet, those people are often not well known in the churches. Their efforts are not necessarily appreciated, partly because they haven't tried to reach out that way, and partly because the churches, the more populist Christian movements, have not been interested. So, yes, I think the book, I still believe what I wrote mostly, but then feel that how I was trying to bring about a remedy wasn't particularly helpful. And I think a remedy now is just to encourage local churches to listen to the people who have worked hard at trying to find out things, and people who worked hard at trying to find out things take part in the local churches.
So it's more about closing the gap between the academics and the non-academics now.
Yeah, that's
than
right.
It is about just having any evangelicals at all who are in the academic game.
That's right.
Yeah.
Although, again, back to what we were talking about earlier, there is a growing reluctance, I think, in the academic realm for people to identify themselves as evangelicals, not because they're worried about anything Christian, but because they're worried about how the word has been used social politically.
Yeah.
That's a different and very new issue with the term now. And I guess I think there's a contingent of people who still hold to the traditional tenets of evangelical faith, but who still want to create a bit of distance between themselves and the name now. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's entirely correct.
Yeah, I think it's quite widespread. I mean, a lot of people have the sense that in America, evangelical just means Republican for most people on the street. And so if you're not Republican, or if you're open for people having different views, then you can't call yourselves evangelical, which I think it's an interesting question for me of sort of do we have a word for this, or is that, I mean, those are kind of big debates. I would say personally, Mark, that I read your book in undergrad and also found it deeply compelling and thought, I want to go to graduate school. I want to pick up the call. And my experience was being rejected profoundly by the Christian communities I was a part of because of that. And I know a lot of people that was their experience as well. And so I do think for me, it's been reflecting on, I had this naive sense that if I go and I learn, I can bring this back to these communities. And they said, we don't want you. We don't want that. And then I was like, oh, what do you do with that?
Yeah, that's hard.
And so I think that's an interesting, and that also, it points for me to this, I think you've kind of said a lot of people today maybe that are leaving evangelicalism never looked around to say, is there more to evangelicalism or even more to Christianity? But the people also in their communities, I think this is a helpful message for them, because sometimes, they're the ones telling these people, if you're not voting this way or doing these things, you're not a Christian and you should leave. And so putting the wrong things kind of first and saying, listen, if you want people to find a place in your community, open things up a bit, help them find a redemptive and grace filled of remaining in this type of faith. So I appreciate sort of what you're voicing there. And I think it maybe speaks maybe even more to those who have stayed than those who have left.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've heard quite recently of a very bright academic who has confessed Christian faith and who was brought to faith by a pastor with very distinct views that in the person's denomination. But when the pastor was talking to this academic, he said to her, look, don't worry about the details. Did Jesus Christ rise from the dead? Look at the first things first, and then the other questions later. And that, to me, was a terrific piece of advice from someone working in a particular church with particular denominational distinctives, but yet was able to identify the most important things as the most important.
This episode is sponsored by the Palm Beach Atlantic University School of Ministry. Located in the heart of West Palm Beach, Florida, PBA offers a range of undergraduate and graduate programs in theology, Bible, ministry, missions, chaplaincy, and apologetics. Learn more at pbaschoolofministry.com.